Hi, my name is Jillian Bell, and I'm here in my house, which is very cool. And I want to talk to you about role-playing games. And today I want to talk about tabletop role-playing games. I've been gaming in some way, shape, and form probably since I was about 5. Once you reach the age of maybe 12 or 13, people expect you to stop playing and playing pretend. And that never really took with me. So one of the outlets that I've found for getting to play even as a grown-up, and if you know me, you know I'm not a grown-up, is role-playing games. And there's been a big resurgence in people being interested in role-playing games. In some ways, it's actually a big surge, thanks to some pretty popular programs, movies, podcasts dealing with different kinds of role-playing games. And one of the things that people tend to ask is how to get started. And there are all kinds of resources out there for you. But there are a few things that I think are more or less universal. And so the first question that comes up is often, what do I need? If I want to start a game, what do I need? Ultimately, the only thing you really need in order to run a game is your imagination. It helps to have some players, and as a games master, you need to make the decision what kind of game, first and foremost, you want to run, because there are so many different kinds of games out there. And when I talk about kinds of games, I'm not necessarily talking about game systems. You've probably heard of Dungeons and Dragons, or Shadowrun, or Magic the Gathering, or any other different kinds of role-playing games, or Magic is actually a collectible card game, or Call of Cthulhu. Great game. But I'm not talking about game systems. I'm talking about the conceptual part of gaming. So you need to figure out if you want to run a competitive game where players either have to solve challenges among one another or between themselves and the story itself, or whether you want to run a collaborative game where the players have to work together to solve common problems and to solve the mystery that you're presenting as the games master. My preference is collaborative games. One of the things that really draws me to collaborative games is that collective problem solving and the sort of creativity that comes out of having a number of people, all with different goals in mind, all with different characters that they've created, coming together and solving problems in ways that you, as the storyteller, would never have thought. So think about whether you want that competitive nature or the collaborative nature. And then from there, it's important for you to talk to your players. There's a whole piece in here about, well, how do I find players, and how do I get the books, and where do I get the miniatures, and how much of this is needed? You don't really need any of that. You can go and get the gaming books at the library. You can go and buy all of the material that you want. But really all you need are a few people and a story. So if you go to the library or the gaming store, you can often find lists of people who are looking to game or join a game, or people who are wanting to get into it. You can look at forums. Discord has a lot of different forums, and they're regionally based. You can look on Reddit, any kind of social media, actually, Facebook. You can just grab a bunch of your friends and say, hey, guys, let's try this gaming thing. If you haven't gamed in a long time, let me tell you, I can hold your hand. There are all sorts of people who want to game. And throughout the province, there are organizations as well that will work to get people into gaming communities. And you can find people through games days or gaming conventions. In Regina, the Flatland Regional Association of Gamers has regular games days. A lot of those have since gained an online component in the last couple of years. So in Saskatoon, you could go to the Amazing Stories comic store, or you could go to Dragon's Den and ask them about their games days. Here in Regina, like I said, there's Flatland Regional Association of Gamers. There's Dungeons and Dinner, which is Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games that are held at different venues throughout the city. And you can also ask at the library, like I said, or at comic readers here in Regina. So there's lots of ways to find players. So once you've got your idea about what kind of game you want to run, and you've started working out who's going to play in your game, there's the next logical step is to just keep in mind that you're telling a story. But in terms of the narrative structure, when normally you would have character, plot, conflict, resolution, setting, you are going to provide the setting, some of the plot, some of the conflict, and hopefully the resolution. Your players are going to bring characters, and believe you me, they're going to bring plot. And they're going to cause some conflict, and it's going to be magnificent. So whether you're the sort of storyteller who likes to plot things out and plan things out, the planner, or whether you're the sort of storyteller that likes to tell stories by the seat of your pants, the pantser, there's places for all of those sorts of styles within any game that you decide to run. The thing to keep in mind is that without your players, it's just you telling stories, which is fantastic, but it might not be what you're going for. So keep in mind that without your players, you're narrating to nobody. So that relationship between you and your players goes both ways. A lot of people will have a session 0 where they sit down and talk about, between the players and the games master, what they want to accomplish, what kind of game they want to play, whether they want to have what's called a hack and slash or a dungeon crawl, whether you want to combat a lot, whether you want to encounter a monster of the week, or whether you want to have very little combat and you want romance, or maybe you want mystery, or maybe you want horror, or maybe your players only want to play a Western that involves dogs who speak and run around just like human beings, anthropomorphic animals. I want to play in that game, so if you're running that game, call me. Those are the sorts of things that you really need to think about in terms of getting set up. And on the heels of that, there's a tacit understanding between a games master and a player. It doesn't really need to be tacit, and sometimes it needs to be out front, and that is what the boundaries are. If you're running a game for people that you've known for all your life, you probably know a lot about what they might like and what they might not like. You might know what sorts of things they're not going to enjoy. You might know that there are some things out there that are going to trigger them. These are important things to talk about before you start running a game. Because when you're in that dungeon and there's a warlock who's attempting to take over the countryside, and he's taken the form of a child, and you present this to your players and find out in the middle of that combat that some of your players absolutely don't want to have anything to do with children in their game, that's going to be a difficult conversation. So those are good things to talk about at your session 0. Again, it's boundaries, and that really all has to do with the respect that will flow between your players and your gamers. At its core, gaming is a social activity. It's a creative social activity. And so you're telling stories together. But you're still going to be in a room with a bunch of people. And if you don't want to be with them for whatever reason, it's going to make the game pretty hard. So we're doing this for fun. We're gaming in our spare time. Very few of us get to get paid for gaming. And that's why that relationship and those understandings are so important. You need to be on the same page. And then when I'm talking about the role of the GM and the players, sometimes there's and there's nothing wrong with what I'm about to say. Sometimes players play in opposition to the DM, the dungeon master. Sometimes players think that the concept of the game is that it's players versus DM, or players versus story, or like I said before, players versus player. In my conceptualization of role-playing games, especially tabletop pen and paper role-playing games, it's really the dungeon master, the DM, and the players against this vast universe. And you're telling the story together. But you will have times when, as the DM, you have to put challenges in front of your players, because stagnation is never fun for anybody. Things that are too easy are never fun in the long run. And you can think about this in terms of the books that you like to read, the stories that you like to hear. If the story that you're listening to is captivating and entrancing and engrossing, and it's the sort of story you just can't put down, it's not because it's the story of someone who doesn't do anything. It could be, but then the conflict becomes a question of why. Why is this person doing the same thing over and over? And why is there this drudgery? And why do they enjoy that? That's your conflict. But you have to think about it in terms of what makes a good story, both for you and for your players. And you're all in this together. So when it comes to those roles, I find that it really helps to keep that in mind. The next thing that you're going to want to tackle is the herding cats part of gaming. And the first thing I want to mention here is something that we lovingly refer to as gamer time. Take any time that has ever existed since the history of the universe and add at least half an hour, and that's gamer time. So if you want to start your game at 7, you may want to ask your players to be there at 6:30. This is a social endeavor. People are going to want to sit and chat. They're going to want to compare their character sheets. They're going to want to go over what happened last game. They're going to want to talk about how their characters have changed if they leveled up. They're going to want to talk about their work or school or any of the things that happen in their everyday life. And it's great to get that out of your system before you're all sitting at the table and you need to be engaged. So build in a little bit of leeway to your timing, because you're going to have gamer time happen. When it comes to scheduling, whatever works is what's going to be the best for you. So lots of folks use Discord. Lots of folks use Facebook. Lots of folks will just say, hey, I'm running a game today at 2. Do you want to show up? Whatever works for your group is perfect. The thing to remember here, the thing that I will recommend here, is that you make sure that everybody's using the same system, because having to send out reminders on 4 different platforms and have a phone tree, it's frustrating. And as a games master, if you've only got 1 or 2 players, that's one thing. But if you're running a game for 8 people around the table, or if you get into live action role playing and you're running a game for 120 people, you need them all to be able to access the same information at the same time. So build a little bit of that into your planning, and I think it will really go far for you. When you have your communications all down pat, it often helps to send out a reminder email a few days before your game is set to go. Send out that reminder and maybe talk a little bit about the last game and what happened and who was stuck in a jail cell and who was outside that jail cell about to throw a fireball in at the guards, and talk about whether or not the goblin is still floating. You know, the normal things that happen. Those sorts of things will get your players, that get their creative juices going, and they'll start remembering how much fun they had at your last game. Then you're going to notice that they're going to talk among each other, and then when they get to your game, they're going to be super excited to get down to brass tacks. That's something that I've really enjoyed doing with my games over the years, is after each game, I'll write a brief write-up, and I try to do it in the style of the game. So if I'm running a Western, I try to throw some Louis L'Amour in there. And if I'm running a horror game, I might try to get some Stephen King or Lovecraft or Edgar Allan Poe feel to those write-ups. A film noir is always a fun thing to do with your game write-ups. So after the game is finished, you do a write-up. You can post it to the forum if you want, or you can just keep it in your own notes. And then when you're sending out the reminder for what's coming up at this game, you can crib from those notes and send those out to your players. You can make that interactive if you want. That leads to some really fun downtime that you can do. So in between games, it's generally what we call downtime. And when you get a bunch of players who are really invested in your game, they don't want it to end. They don't want to wait for another week or another month, or in some cases, another year. They want to play again right away. When you end those games on a high note and everybody says no at the end of the night because they don't want to quit, you can start encouraging that collaborative storytelling to happen in between games. Google Docs is great for this. You can set up scenes, do a little introductory paragraph, invite your players to the scene, and they'll start telling the story when nobody's in the room. It's ghost storytelling, and it's amazing. This all works really well, these after game, before game tips, when you're running a longer style game, a campaign game, where you have more than one episode of your game. And think about it like chapters, not the store. You can think about it like the store if you want, but I'm talking about the chapters of a book or the parts of a story. You'll play one night, and then the same story, you'll play the same characters, the same setting, you'll pick up where you left off. There have been campaign games that have been running for 40 years. There have been campaign games that only run 3 games. That's in opposition to a one-shot game, where you really only want to tell a little encapsulated story, a piece of flash fiction, a short story, a haiku. And one-shots are a lot of fun. You encounter a lot of one-shots at gaming conventions or at some of the gaming type events that I mentioned earlier. They can be really fun, bite-sized morsels. If you've never tried Call of Cthulhu and you'd really like to try a horror game, think about trying to find a one-shot or trying to run a one-shot just to see how that game works, how it feels, whether or not your characters, your players can be engaged. And one-shots can be a lot of fun for themed games as well. You can drop, this is the mind-bending part, you can drop one-shots into your campaign games. So you can have all of the characters play somebody else for a night. You could have all of the characters transported magically to some other universe or some other realm, and you hand out character sheets to them at the beginning of the night and say, this is who you're playing tonight, and then you get a little one-shot. Outside of that, though, you want to throw together, you've got some friends coming into town, you want to throw together a game. There are all kinds of pre-written adventures that are out there. And there are some things to think about when you're planning one-shots versus campaigns. And I'm going to get to that in a little minute when I start talking about pacing and the narrative structure of games. It still helps to send out all of those communications, especially if you're doing a one-shot, because it doesn't matter how often you say, we're going to play our one-shot on September 9th at the Snack Shack at 7 o'clock. If you have 4 players in your game, you'll get 5 questions about when the next game is going to be. And that's just the nature of who people are, and it's fantastic. So again, we sort of go back to communications there. When you're looking at actually getting down to running a game, you've got your players set. You've had your session 0. You've thought about what kind of a story you want to tell. Maybe you've even gone into world building. You don't want to use a setting that's already out there. You want to do something that's completely all yours. Awesome. Brilliant. The one thing that is good to keep in mind is consistency. You don't need to know all of the things. You don't need to have all of the answers. But you do need to know a few things. And you need to be confident in the continuum of how your world or your setting works. This is true when you're writing stories, when you're telling stories, or when you're running a game. If you're setting your game in a fantasy realm where teapots are the sentient race, you need to know, does the gravity still work the same in this realm? What happens when a teapot baby falls off the Chesterfield? Is it going to crack apart? Can it reform? Does it just die? Do they make more teapot babies? Where do teapot babies even come from? These are the sorts of things keep in the back of your mind, because it's going to need to be the same from one game to the next, unless it isn't. And if it isn't, you need to have a reason for why it isn't the same time after time. Consistency is important. And that's true, like I said, of storytelling or writing or gaming. It's all the same kettle of fish. If you've chosen to do a campaign game, here's a trick. You're going to need to have this in your back pocket. Remember when I said that it doesn't matter if you plan everything out, your players are going to bring their own story to the table? You can write the perfect game. Absolutely stunning. People will play this game and they will fall over dead because it's so good. And your players will sit down at the table. And the first thing they'll do is not engage with the plot at all. They're going to come up with something that they want to do. There will be an item on the menu that says, for gaming, order this. And they'll say, you know what, I don't even like menus. So it's always a good idea to have in your back pocket a couple of ideas about what you might throw at your players, how you might get them to your plot if they're not going to bite. This is the fishing expedition. Maybe instead of having all of your characters at a tavern encounter someone who's going to hire them to return a relic from the church, and they all decide they don't feel like going to meet that person today, maybe they have an encounter in the alley where a troll starts a fight with them and ends up taking them to the person that they have to talk to anyway. Or maybe the person that they have to talk to steps in and stops that fight. Or maybe someone from the church comes and begs them to return the relic. Maybe they need to go on a camping trip and just role play together for a while. It's really easy to throw an encounter or two at players when they're in the throes of role playing. It's a lot more difficult to push them towards something. And as a player, that can be really unfulfilling, feeling like you're being pushed. All good stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They might not all occur in that order, but though they're all going to be there. You might not hear the beginning of the story until somewhere in the middle. You might start the game at the end. You might start the story at the end. One-shot games need to be really encapsulated. You have to have the beginning, the middle, of the end structured in such a way that it can be resolved within the 3 hours or 6 hours or however long your one-shot is going to be. If you want to have a much longer beginning, middle, and end, you have the luxury of time when you're running a campaign. But you still need to have those 3 elements. The middle part needs to have your conflict. And we talked a little bit about this before. Without conflict, nobody's going to be engaged. Something to think about. If you're running a game like Dungeons and Dragons, I'll use this as an example because I think it's probably the most popular game out there and probably the most widely played. When you're putting an encounter in front of your players, and that's going to involve some sort of conflict or combat, and you end up going into a turns-based event where everyone takes their turn to do their action. Each player will take between 5 and 10 minutes, roughly, to resolve their action. If you have 6 people at the table it can take half an hour to 45 minutes to get through one round of combat. And so if you're looking at throwing all kinds of combat at your players, you might only be able to get through 2 combat sessions in any one game. This leads to, as a player, there are certain things that you should do to help your game along. And when it gets to those sessions where you are encountering combat or turns-based activity, be ready on your turn. Listen to what the other players at the table are doing, so that when it comes to you, you're not flipping through your character sheet trying to find your spells or trying to look for your character sheet or having to say to your DM every single time, well, what just happened? Who did what? Where's that orc coming from? It really pays to be a good listener and to be engaged, even when it's not your turn. That'll speed things up. And then everybody's going to there's going to be less of a chance that you'll lose people to their phones, or you'll lose people to their knitting, or you'll have too much crosstalk with players at the table. You don't want to lose people. So moving that action along really helps, and being prepared as a player, it's what DMs dream of. Campaign games and one-shots should have a shape to them. So, exciting. So you can take a look at some of the resources that are out there. And again, the library is great for this. Go and look up some of what Kurt Vonnegut has written about the shape of stories and how, there are archetypes for stories, just like there are archetypes for characters. Do you want a story that has pacing that starts here and ramps up right away, and then the pacing is like chock-a-block crazy the whole time? Do you want a game that has ups and downs? Do you want a game that's just sort of, easy pacing all the way through? When it comes to storytelling, conflict is what's going to drive your pace. So if you would like to let your players have a little bit of just a role-playing session where there's not a lot being thrown at them, dial back the conflict a little bit. Let them explore the universe that you've created. If you find that the story is dragging or you're losing players to their magic blinky box, you might want to throw in an encounter. Maybe in this beautiful Fey Acre where the fairies are cavorting with leaf dragons, maybe there's something sinister there and a bunch of spiders invade. Up to you. But think about that in terms of your pacing, because that does inform the shape of the story. Think about how long it might take your players to solve puzzles, because not every game is about either role-playing or combat. There's also puzzle solving, and some of the best games are when you throw these puzzles in front of your players and have them try to put them together. It could be physical. You could bring a physical puzzle to the game and say, you guys have to solve it. You could provide a series of hints throughout their adventure that once they get to a certain point, they realize, wait a minute, 3 turns ago we saw something on the wall, and now we need to know that information. Those puzzles can be simple. You can have them do a game of hangman if you want, or they can be really complex. But think about how long it's going to take them to solve it. How are you going to give them hints for the game and for the puzzle and how to solve things? You want to avoid the bogged down snail's pacing that leaves players feeling unengaged. I had a storyteller once who, as soon as we sat down at the gaming table, he had us all put our phones into a locked box. We weren't allowed to touch them until the end of the game. I've played in games where if you were the sort of person who liked to step outside for a few minutes to visit, you wouldn't be allowed back in. So think about the shape of your game and the pacing, and try to make sure that everybody's going to stay engaged. Good storytelling involves continuity, balance, intrigue, action and adventure, internal story consistency, and you can throw in calamity and ridiculousness and danger and threats, but there has to be redemption at some point, and there has to be resolution. That's part of the internal story consistency. If your players never take risks, if they never face any real danger, they won't be left feeling fulfilled. There should be a point in every game where a character is at risk of dying. And let me be very clear when I'm saying a character and not a player, because you may have nights when you accidentally get those mixed up. Please leave the rocks on the floor where they belong. Don't be mean to each other. It can be very frustrating when you've put a lot of work into something and the players that sit down at your table are doing something that you don't want them to do. I really encourage you to embrace that creativity and look at the places where you can provide danger, challenges, conflict, redemption, and resolution for your players. Those are going to be the best sessions. Those are the ones that people are going to remember. You don't ever find people sitting around a gaming table 25 years later saying, "Do you remember that one game that we had where we just walked?" Not going to happen. You're going to have players saying, "Do you remember that one game where we played and it was in an insane asylum and I think like people were actually going crazy?" You want to cause your characters to suffer. You don't want to cause your players to suffer. If you do, that's a very different kind of game that you're playing. So just keep that in mind when it comes to the shape of stories and the pace of stories. What makes a good player? I know you've probably heard this, Will Wheaton's rule, don't be I don't know if I can say that in the library. So there might be a beep. But honestly, this is the kind of overarching theme for most of the basics of how to be a good player. Be on time. I mean, I joked about gamer time, but people are giving their spare time, their free time to hang out and play these games. And you have to build in an inevitable amount of stuff that's going to happen at your gaming table that's going to prevent you from starting on time. But being late or being super early on a regular basis starts looking like a kind of a casual disregard for your GM, Games Master, or for the players. So do your best to be on time. If you're not going to be on time, call somebody up and say, I'm in Regina, there's a train. Or I'm in Saskatoon and I'm on Idlewild. We understand. Be respectful. And this should go without saying, but I'm going to say it. If you're playing in someone's home, take care to treat their home and their hospitality graciously. If you happen to break the china that they got for their wedding, and you feel really bad about it, you can apologize. No, try not to break their wedding china because you feel really bad about that for a long, long time. And that totally didn't happen to me, but if it did, I'd still feel guilty. If you're playing in a public space, remember there are people who have no idea what you're doing. So assume some of them are children or grannies and just keep that in mind. They don't know that you are pretending to murder each other. Okay? They don't know that what you're talking about is a story. So just keep that in mind when you're in public. Bring your own stuff. Gaming doesn't have to be expensive. You don't need to buy books. You don't need to use miniatures and paint them, but you should because it's super funny. You don't need to buy expensive, sparkly clack-clack rocks, otherwise known as dice. If you're a gamer, you know that you have to buy the super sparkly and expensive clack-clack rocks. You really don't have to. DMs and most players are probably happy to share what they have. Ask, because some players, and I'm not going to name any names, but I'm one of them, believe that dice have mojo, and this is absolutely 100% true. And if you touch another person's dice, you can ruin their dice mojo, and that can make them roll really badly for the rest of time. So before you touch their mojo dice, just ask. Most people are happy to share what they have with you. But always make sure you bring a pen and pencil. If you have a game that involves snacks, bringing snacks or drinks, or you're going to have supper together, find out what the protocol is. Does everybody pool their snacks? Do you have someone at the table who's super protective of their cheesies? That's me. Does everybody pool a few dollars at the end of the game to offer the DM a reward? Do you all bring your own? How does that work? Just find out. And it should go without saying, but I'm going to say it. Most people don't want to sit around a table and listen to someone using bigoted, cruel, insensitive language. That might be the kind of game you're playing, and if everybody around the table has consented that that's okay with them, great. Play your horrible character that you're playing. But be the kind of player that you'd want to spend time with. Because you will get into situations as a DM and as a player where you will have conflict at the table, and you're going to need to sit down and talk about it, and there are going to be hurt feelings. So what you can do to mitigate that is be the sort of player that you'd want to be around the table with. When it comes to conflict resolution, the best thing I can say is do your best to be respectful about it. Focus on actions, not people. Focus on how actions have affected you, and focus on making a better game instead of poking at what may have been done in a way you don't like. Best advice I have there. It's never fun when that happens, and it probably will, and it's a challenge, but it's worth it to fix it and work it out. Keep the out-of-character table talk to a minimum. It's a social endeavor, but if everybody at the table is talking about my cheesies, they're my cheesies, you're going to start getting people who are distracted, and they're not going to be able to engage. Don't be a backseat DM. You probably know all of the rules. If you don't know all of the rules, that's fine. If you do know all of the rules, that's great. There's a time and a place to argue with the DM about why things are being done the way they are. Asking questions is great. Getting into a long, protracted rules discussion just makes people grumpy. So take note of the things that you didn't agree with and talk about it with your DM afterwards or with the rest of the crew. If it's something really simple where you want to say, normally this rule works in this way, I've noticed you're ruling it in a different way. Why is that? That's a great way to just open up a conversation. As a player, always remember, bad things do happen to good characters. Characters can and do experience negative consequences. If you are a dwarf and you're in full battle armor and you decide to run across a rope bridge that's over a 500-foot drop over a chasm, bad things happen to good characters. He was a good dwarf. Your characters can die. Your character can become unplayable through the course of a game. And it's really easy to get attached to your characters because you're pouring your heart and soul into these weird people that you're pretending to be. It can be upsetting when you lose one. But again, reward only comes at the expense of risk. So if you make a character who never takes risks and who doesn't like to interact in dangerous situations, that might be an interesting character choice if you're looking at exploring that as an area of growth. But if you never want to take any risks, you're probably going to be limiting yourself, and you might not have the kind of fun that you could have. There are some games where characters never die. If that's the kind of game you want to play, back to session 0. Tell your DM, I think I would be devastated if this character died. Your DM might say, understood. Your character might die. Your DM might say, okay, duly noted. Have those discussions. Let everyone have their say. Gamers come in all designs. Some of us are boisterous and outgoing, and others are quiet and reserved. And it can be really easy, if you're an excited player, and I'm not naming names, but that's me, to steal the limelight. It's really easy if you're into drama and you're into improv and you like to talk with your hands, to take over the gaming table. I really encourage you to sit back and see who else is around the table and engage them and make sure that everybody's having as awesome an experience as you are. It's easy for us to take over, us outgoing people, and so we just need to make space for everybody at the table. Try not to talk over other people. If you're like me, you have the loudest voice at the table. Sorry, everybody, I have the loudest voice at the table. And so again, just sort of sit back and make sure that everybody is getting their space. When you're coming to the gaming table, I think these are really good things that you'll be able to do to get you started. There are going to be a lot of fun times ahead of you, and there's going to be some challenging times ahead of you. And in the end, it's going to be worth it, because in 5 years, in 25 years, you will be sitting in a retirement home with someone, and you will say, do you remember the time that Quinn ran his dwarf off of that rope bridge and laid at the bottom of a chasm, wheezing and dying. That's going to happen. You are going to have inside jokes that you tell for the rest of your life that come out of gaming. And it's going to be one of the most rewarding experiences of your life. If you don't like it, try it again. Try everything twice, because the first time might have just been a bad day. Thank you for letting me come to you and tell you about one of my big passions, which is gaming. And I encourage you to go to your local library and find out if you have any gaming groups wherever you are. And I really do encourage you to look into some collaborative storytelling, different kinds of role-playing games, and just really have fun. Fun doesn't have to end when you're 13 years old. Thanks.